considering, as we covered recently, the appointment to be the deputy to RFK, deputy HHS secretary being Jim O'Neill, who's a longtime Peter Thiel associate, used to run the Thiel Foundation, co-founded the Thiel Fellowship with Peter Thiel, worked at Mithril Capital and also Clarium Capital, which is now Thiel Capital. And obviously at Mithril, he was J.D. Vance's boss, I guess, where, significant investments in biotech and also in Palantir were made.
In this video, Whitney Webb discusses the appointment of Jim O'Neill as Deputy HHS Secretary under RFK Jr., highlighting his deep connections to Peter Thiel and investment in biotech and Palantir. The speaker questions whether RFK Jr.'s statements to the Senate, which seemed more moderate compared to his campaign rhetoric, reflect his actual intentions or were merely political maneuvers for confirmation. The discussion also touches on a Wall Street Journal report suggesting RFK Jr. distanced himself from anti-vaccine allies in favor of Trump-appointed staff, like Heather Flick, who was previously involved in Operation Warp Speed, raising concerns about the true direction of his policies at HHS.
So I think, obviously there are the devil's advocates out there that say, well, of course, RFK had to say these things in front of the Senate, otherwise he can't be confirmed. But sort of that wishy-washiness as a means of obtaining political power, it opens up enough doubt that you can't really know if that's true or not. And if he's expressing, the viewpoints he expressed there to the Senate, it's certainly possible that he plans to implement those policies stated there. Obviously, he'd experience a lot more resistance if he were to pursue stuff he said, back when he was on the campaign trail, for example. But again, it remains to be seen, I think, to an extent with RFK as HHS secretary, but I think there have been some revealing statements even before, and reports even before his confirmation hearing. So one of these was a Wall Street Journal article that's from January 14th, so almost a month ago. And it's entitled "Trump Team Sidelines RFK Jr.'s Anti-Vaccine Aides." And essentially that article, citing people close to both Trump and Kennedy, says that Kennedy was sort of dumping a lot of his people close to him that were expected to serve as aides if he were appointed to HHS, that he had affiliations with from Children's Health Defense, from example, in favor of, it seems like he didn't really pick his staff, actually. So one of these would be that his chief of staff is Heather Flick, who was picked by Trump, who was previously involved with Alex Azar's HHS, which was Trump's first term. And, was the HHS that first declared COVID a health emergency and oversaw a lot of the creation and implementation of Operation Warp Speed before Biden came into office. And so there is a section in this article that basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially said something to the effect that he was going to not pursue changes to vaccine policy because instead was going to focus on wins in food and exercise. And it's interesting that that report came out when it did, because in the months prior to that, sort of these several influential figures sort of seemed to come out of nowhere after the Kennedy endorsement of Trump, namely the Means siblings, Callie and Casey Means, and started promoting a lot of the stuff about sort of blaming the chronic disease epidemic, as it's been referred to, in which I agree with the nomenclature there, as being, pretty much entirely due to big food, but only specific aspects of things in big food. I don't think biotech, GMOs and the food supply have been really addressed meaningfully by the Mean siblings, but have sort of focused on the unhealthy standard American diet and sort of this promotion of things like beef tallow, among other things, which, is fine. I'm certainly not criticizing those claims, but I think it's sort of an effort to engineer a more myopic stance for MAHA so that it's easier to secure those quote unquote wins for the movement and sort of act like campaign promises to that coalition were fulfilled, while avoiding the ones that involve removing industry influence from HHS and the FDA, for example, and anything that would have to do with sort of taking mRNA products off the market or making it more difficult to get on the market.
The conversation then explores O'Neill's controversial stance on eliminating efficacy testing at the FDA, a move that would accelerate biotech product approvals but could also undermine safety regulations. The speaker notes that O'Neill was previously deemed too controversial for an FDA leadership role under Trump's first term. The discussion also connects these policy shifts to broader concerns about the rapid approval of mRNA products during the COVID-19 pandemic. The deregulation that allowed these vaccines onto the market is viewed as a precedent for further expanding experimental biotechnology, possibly for financial and strategic gains rather than public health.
Well, I think there's the potential also to do some sort of dynamic, some good cop, bad cop dynamic, at least in terms of public perception with HHS policy going forward. Considering, as we covered recently, the appointment to be the deputy to RFK, deputy HHS secretary being Jim O'Neill, who's a longtime Peter Thiel associate, used to run the Thiel Foundation, co-founded the Thiel Fellowship with Peter Thiel, worked at Mithril Capital and also Clarium Capital, which is now Thiel Capital. And obviously at Mithril, he was J.D. Vance's boss, I guess, where, significant investments in biotech and also in Palantir were made. So Jim O'Neill, and as you can read our article on this for all the nitty-gritty details, he essentially has been arguing for quite some time for the ending of efficacy testing of products at, I guess, the FDA specifically. He was actually floated to be FDA head under the first Trump administration and was considered too controversial for that role. And I can't remember if Balaji Srinivasan, who's the Andreessen Horowitz partner that created the network state idea, he was also pitched to be head of FDA, but was also deemed too controversial. And then they settled, I guess, on Scott Gottlieb, who became kind of infamous during the COVID era for his revolving door relationship with Pfizer. And also this CIA-linked company that's now doing all the biomanufacturing for this, a lot of the mRNA vaccines. It's called Resilience. I think previously was called National Resilience, that I reported on a few years ago. But essentially, Jim O'Neill, by eliminating efficacy tests, would facilitate a lot of these products getting on the market because, as a lot of my past reporting and reporting of others has noted about these mRNA products and what was even known about them before the COVID-19 event. Basically, you can either make them safe but not effective or toxic and effective. It's kind of like this slider where you either get one or the other. And that makes it, of course, very difficult for them to get through the existing regulatory paradigm at the FDA. And as we noted just a minute ago, a lot of what was the initial ambition, at least publicly expressed, of this MAHA movement was about more stringent clinical testing for these types of experimental products. Because, of course, a lot of the controversy around what happened during COVID-19 is that, the emergency deregulatory paradigm was used to force this experimental biotech onto the market and onto the public. And basically the people that took it became guinea pigs. And this is when you consider that for 10 years, Moderna and, Pfizer's BioNTech, they couldn't get anything on the market because they couldn't even get through animal trials. All of a sudden they can get on the market. And so some of these companies have been around for like 15 years or longer in some cases and haven't been able to get anything on the market. So obviously the only way to get it on the market thus far has been to, use COVID-19 vaccines because of, the emergency use authorization. I would technically call it a loophole in this case. But it's really the only way that it's been able to go on the market. Obviously, it seems like the testing for livestock, there's been a lot of talk about mRNA products already being with the livestock. I guess there are cases where it does get through animal trials for animal vaccines, but I have a feeling that animal vaccine testing is a lot less stringent than it is for humans. And I don't know. Well, I'm kind of I think it's interesting, this whole ending efficacy testing paradigm, because of course it's being framed as a way to remove needless regulation and bureaucratic red tape, and to make way for free market innovation. And these are, kind of the standard Republican talking points here.
Webb concludes with broader concerns about the normalization of experimental biotech under the next administration, regardless of political branding. Entities like the Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and U.S. government investments in biotech are highlighted as key players pushing this agenda. The speaker suggests that RFK Jr. may be constrained by his staff, particularly Flicken O'Neill, limiting his ability to challenge industry influence in the way he once advocated. The overarching concern is that, despite public messaging, the expansion of biotech and mRNA-based interventions will continue under the guise of regulatory efficiency and innovation.
Obviously, what happened during COVID-19 was a removal, technically, right, of that bureaucratic red tape. And it sort of unleashed a very corrupt pharmaceutical industry, or wing of it rather, in biotech, to have no liability for these experimental products and have them used massively and to reap massive profits from them. And of course, now that's been pitched as the U.S. government would share in those profits. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, in the press conference announcing the creation of a new U.S. sovereign wealth fund, commented how the U.S. would begin buying equity in these types of vaccine companies, so that when COVID-19 vaccines, for example, are sold abroad, the U.S. government has a direct financial incentive, which is pretty telling, I think, of where this administration plans to go with mRNA. And I think also some of the controversial statements made by Oracle's Larry Ellison at the Stargate press conference on Trump's first day in the White House about this new era of AI-powered, personalized mRNA vaccines for cancer. A lot of these mRNA companies that got, sort of looked at by independent media during COVID, a lot of them have been focusing on cancer specifically for a long time, because you can basically charge more because you're making a personalized vaccine for each person. There's been a push for this. It was arguably one of the reasons that Biden created the ARPA-H, the Health DARPA agency, which he framed as a cancer moonshot. A lot of it was framed around this very same idea that is being promoted on day one of the Trump White House, which is quite telling. So the main guy behind it is this guy named Bob Wright, who is the top executive at NBC Universal, and he's a good friend of Trump because that is the network that brought you the Apprentice. But it was the main architect that was hired by Wright to design the program as an ex-DARPA guy named Jeffrey Ling, who was basically running a lot of the experimental biotech stuff at DARPA. Because initially, a lot of this mRNA technology came out of DARPA funding, a lot of it happening under the Obama administration. Their DARPA. And since then, the director of DARPA, when those initial investments in mRNA were made, is Regina Dugan, and she has since become head of the Wellcome Trust's own DARPA equivalent called Wellcome Leap, that I reported on a few years ago. So, it's notable, I think, that this is set to expand in the U.S. under the current administration, because a lot of the same entities that were vilified during COVID, and I think were rightly vilified personally, whether that's the Wellcome Trust or Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, are all in on biotech and really see it as necessary to expand their ambitions for global health and, the health-related sustainable development goals, which I've argued, in my work on the SDGs, is really about creating new markets and using public policy to impose those markets on people, because there's no actual demand for the products of these markets that they're making. And that kind of, I think maybe kind of similar to what ends up happening here. It's ultimately, maybe the sales pitches are different, or the way it's being marketed is going to be different, under Trump. But ultimately, having this type of experimental biotechnology be all over the market and it's used to be normalized, I think is definitely something that we can expect over the next 4 years, unfortunately. And I think
Yeah.
another indicator of this, in addition to sort of these quote unquote babysitters that are actually going to be running the show for RFK, he's nominally the head, but Heather Flick, as chief of staff, decides who gets access to him, what his schedule is, what he does as HHS secretary, basically. And then Jim O'Neill being basically the person who manages day-to-day operations and oversees the FDA and all these sub-agencies on Kennedy's behalf. There is a lot of room to go against Kennedy, even if Kennedy was intent on challenging biotech as head of HHS. And as you noted earlier, it's not necessarily clear that is the case. But I don't want to come out and say it's not.
Thanks for watching. Help support this channel and receive exclusive offers from one of our partners located in the description. We'll see you on the next one.